Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one more interview on DojoLIVE, connecting experts like you, and like you, and like you, like everyone else here today. So thank you for joining me, and joining me today from different locations. We have different people. Some of them are my teammates. Victor Castrejon. Victor, how you doing? Hello, it's good to have you here, Victor. Victor is in Hermosillo. And of course, Tulio Zaragoza, he's in LA. Hi, Tulio.
Hi.
And my fellow teammate, our most recent acquisition, Carmen.
Hi.
Carmen is in Hermosillo too. And well, it's good to have you here for another interview on DojoLIVE. And today we're going to be interviewing Daryn Harpaz. Daryn is the CEO at the ZenythGroup, and he's going to be telling us all about his company. And we're going to be talking about technology and website accessibility. Right, Daryn?
That's right. That's right.
Thank Perfect. You. Okay, it's good to have you here. It's an honor. We're very pleased. And okay, so we're going to be talking about building smart technology to drive website accessibility. And to help me with this, I'm going to pass on the mic to Carmen. Carmen, do you want to do the honors and continue the conversation with Daryn, please? Again, thank you so much, everyone. And
thank you,
please,
Carlos.
The mic's all yours.
Thank you, Carlos. So we're talking about Daryn Harpaz. First of all, we need to know who is Daryn. What is the ZenythGroup and what does it do?
Well, Carmen, hi. Thanks for having me on the show. It's great to be here. I'm an IT strategist. I consider myself to be a technologist, and I'm very interested in compliance for websites and helping to drive accessibility and disability through smart technology. ZenythGroup is a full-service digital agency located here in Los Angeles, and we provide websites and mobile apps with a focus on disabilities and website accessibility.
That sounds actually really cool and really open. But the thing is, you chose building a smart technology to drive website accessibility. And what it really makes me most of my thoughts and most of my questions are like the word accessibility. What does accessibility at ZenythGroup mean? What does it want to do?
Well, I mean, this is a much broader conversation, so we really have to take a step back and understand the landscape. We have to understand, you know, the population that's affected by disability, and we have to kind of understand all the different elements that make up disability, and where we're essentially playing, which is an intersection of disability and accessibility. So just to take a step backwards, you know, I always like to ask my audience if they know anybody that is affected by disability and what type. We don't have the benefit of seeing hands raised right now, but typically a lot of people do raise their hands, and you get to understand from the general population that this is, you know, a very significant issue. The World Health Survey is a little bit dated, it's from 2014, but there are over 1 billion people in the world that are affected with a disability. Almost 16% of that statistic are people that are 15 years and older. There's a significant population. The CDC recently just announced an update to their statistics on on people with disabilities. I'm sorry, with autism. The ratio has gone from 1 in 68 to 1 in 59. And that's 1 in 37 boys, 1 in 151 girls that are affected by autism. And so when you look at the whole spectrum of disability, you're talking about several factors. There's vision impairment, there's deaf and hard of hearing, of course, mental health conditions and intellectual disabilities. There's the autism spectrum I just mentioned, and then, you know, a host and slew of physical disabilities. So it's extremely large spectrum, and it's a big issue to tackle. And so you ask the question of, you know, why disabilities and how we're playing in this space. So when you look at the composition, the makeup of that, there's these trends, right? There's these trends, these you know, numbers don't lie at the end of the day. We are seeing a prevalence, a growing number of people with disabilities. It's on the rise. Across diversity, we are seeing a correlation that while disability correlates with disadvantaged people, not all people with disabilities are equally disadvantaged. So this affects all classes and all socio and economic classes as well. Although there is a specific disability, disabilities are proportional to vulnerable populations, which is kind of interesting. So from a technology point of view, to cater to this spectrum, specific guidelines were created. They're called WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Anybody who is familiar with the disability space is familiar with these guidelines. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the guidelines, but essentially that's where we start. I was always fascinated about building a website that could be compliant to a user that has a disability. We're actually on the precipice of a new guideline being launched right now, WCAG 2.1 guidelines, which focus a lot on, amongst others, a push across mobile devices because it's becoming so much more prevalent. So, you know, around that, there's certainly a ton of work, a ton of opportunity, and a very large demographic that is in need of sites that are compliant, just based on other factors I just mentioned, and of course the prevalence of websites and online data in general. So I just wanted to mention that as a background and a bit of a backdrop to our conversation today. I don't want to spend too much time getting too technical, but those are some of the more important elements that make up the foundation of this conversation. Hopefully that answers your question.
Actually, that's quite interesting because, you know, when you see those numbers, you get surprised how technology, maybe there's no, they don't pay too much attention with people with disabilities, and it's great to know that there is actual technology who does. That there's actually a group who does.
Over 1 billion people. It's quite frightening.
So, Tulio, I believe you have a few questions for.
Yeah. So Daryn, I'm curious. First of all, what gave birth to this idea? Why did you focus on this personally? What drove you to pick this as your calling in terms of your business?
That's a great question, Tulio. We might not have enough time to answer that question. I'll do my best. Several years ago, I was fortunate enough to do a technology project for a large autism services provider company here in LA. And prior to that, I had very little experience with the technology side of the equation. I had some family that were on the spectrum, some distant cousins, and it was very much a, you know, don't talk about it, kind of, they're different, not inclusive, you know, almost like a segmented part of the population. And when I started working on this tech for this autism company, I realized that feeling of excluding people with disabilities and making them a special use case felt wrong. And the technology essentially, you know, adaptive technology benefits all of us in some capacity. And I started focusing on how we could essentially drive you know, our products and services, our business model, our focus to be more inclusive. It really just came out of that idea of trying to be more inclusive and not differentiate across the population. Fast forward 6-7 years later, as you all know, with the artificial intelligence, you know, social media, the amount of billions of pictures that are uploaded daily, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There's a need to manage, correlate, and present all this data to a very diverse, you know, audience, not all with disabilities. So we'll speak about this in a moment, but interestingly, assistive or adaptive technologies are actually helping to solve challenges and problems that are not exclusive to just people with disabilities. Of course, they help. And that ties in very nicely to our initial vision or mission to build tech that was accessible for people of all types, not just those with disabilities.
Why do you think this isn't a standard across the entire web? Are there companies that have to have this in place, and why?
Sorry, did you ask if it is a standard or if it is not a standard?
I'm just curious, is there a movement to make this just a standard worldwide, and are there companies that have to have this, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're talking a moment ago about WCAG requirements. These are a standard. I don't want to kind of get too dry, but web content accessibility guidelines are part of, let's call it a series of web accessibility guidelines. And these are published by the Web Accessibility Initiative, the WAI. And they're kind of essentially a part of the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, which I'm sure you have all heard of. These guys are the main international standards organization for the internet, which is great because they can essentially create and distribute and regulate these requirements. The challenge is, as we all know, how do you keep up with guidelines that are outpaced by the rapid acceleration of technology, the growing population, the prevalence of the diagnoses across the spectrum, and just the massive amount of population of people that have disabilities. So these guidelines are evolving, not fast enough, but WCAG 2.1 guidelines have just been announced. And to answer your question directly, if you currently have a site that is compliant in any capacity, the 2.1 guidelines essentially require you to update and improve your current accessibility initiative. And this is essentially the intersection of our business model and our interest in helping companies become compliant and building tech around these new guidelines. If you are a business that does commerce or transactions with a governing body, federal, state, regional, local, you are required by law to have an accessible website that is compliant. If not, there are certainly fines that can be imposed, loss of revenue, reputation, and just no business from the government bodies. So you want to be compliant, of course.
Wow. So we have with us a pretty big participant group here, and I want to acknowledge we have Misael, who heads up our product design team. And one of the questions that often comes up is obviously about the user experience, right? For people who would normally not be able to see sites the way you and I would see them. Is there a sort of evolution forward that will come into play with things like chatbots or virtual assistants? How is that going to enhance accessibility? And then I'd like to have these guys ask you a few more questions because they play in this space every day. But is there something that's going to make this more easily adaptable for everyone? What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is, and I think that's a large part of our conversation today. Just to take a tiny step backwards, you've got these essentially these anchor tenants, these foundational constructs of WCAG in general, requiring accessibility websites to be perceivable. Michelle can talk this from a UI UX point of view. You have to have the content be operable. They go on to define as understandable and robust. So how does this translate across a user interface or user experience? And I think that's generally the conversation that we're going to have right now. So just to frame this up, we have we like to make a distinction between accessibility, diversity, and user experience. We all know what accessibility is. Of course, we all know what diversity is. And here we're talking about user experience. If you drew those three elements as intersecting circles, that middle ground would be the forefront of the new technology that you're talking about, Tulio, essentially artificial intelligence, adaptive technologies that are using chatbots, and now a slew of new tech, such as image recognition, facial recognition, incredible new lip reading technology, text summarization, automatic translation. These are technologies that we're seeing in the marketplace today. Facebook, the statistic is that across Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and I believe WhatsApp, they estimate 2 billion photographs being uploaded a day. Like, who could possibly manage the metadata behind those images? So, Facebook's technology is essentially an automatic alternative text feature which dynamically describes these images to people that are blind and visually impaired. That's huge. It's huge AI tech behind that kind of initiative. Same with facial recognition, doing away with the old capture images and allowing facial recognition to do away with password security, access to certain content, etc. So I'm not going to run through all the categories right now, but to answer your question directly, I think AI is the central premise, the foundational construct of how we're going to be moving our industry forward, and where accessibility and usability meets those 4 criteria of the WCAG guidelines we talked about before, which are the central tenets of making content accessible.
Right. I do have a question. So this is Misael, and myself being a designer, I was wondering about how to, drive this accessibility project in practice. Sometimes, and based on my experience, when we are talking about user experience, clients don't often recognize the value of some UX practices like research, for instance. So it seems to me like UX is more like a layer sometimes for some type of clients. And when we're talking about accessibility, it's like an extra layer that we need to add to the project. So how does one sell this idea that we need to be accessible compliance?
Yeah, Marcel, it's a very good question, and I don't think it has an absolute answer. I believe that the companies that and the clients that are concerned and interested in appealing to that demographic and user base they get it. They find us because we are providing a service they're looking for, and they are they're looking for that type of response. I don't feel like accessibility should have to be a hard sell. I feel that companies should have the goodwill and the construct to appeal to a larger audience. Imagine if in a tangible example, if you built, or it does exist of course, but you build a retail store and you only make it accessible to one part of your population, one demographic. I mean, you would essentially be less accessible across your entire audience, right? I look at websites the same way. The kind of people that are going to come to us want to broaden their reach. They are interested in having accessible websites, and it's not a hard sell to them. I realize the dilemma that front-end designers and UI UX experience, because just like research, it's very intangible. But at the end of the day, the data that comes out of the research is the difference between a usable or a non-usable product, right? It is either your competitive advantage or you're just another site that doesn't differentiate across its brand.
Right. In the case of UX research, what we've done to go beyond this barrier in which they don't understand the value of research or UX is just start to talk about the same language with stakeholders. Like you are losing money because you have not been providing like a delightful experience to your customers, and you are having a lot of support tickets because you are not doing this part of the interaction right. So I wonder, how can we speak the same language when it comes to accessibility to stakeholders? Thinking more in terms of market share, how much market are we losing because we are not being accessible in making our content accessible.
Yeah, it's a good conversation to have. I mean, we have to differentiate between the two specific types of let's just call them clients at this point, or user groups. If you are, like I mentioned before, a business that does that transacts with the state in any capacity, federal government, state governments, you have to have a compliant site. And there are, of course, millions of companies doing business with the government. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of market space there. I also do believe that there's a prevalence of, an increase of companies that are wanting to be more compliant, because there's a bigger push for it right now, just through the technology I spoke about before. And I also think that the voice, the representation of the disability space is becoming louder when you look at some of the national platforms, like the Autism Foundation and these kind of societies. They are big advocates, and they are pushing for change, and they're speaking on the highest levels of government and big business. And in fact, some of the largest sites on the internet, our Fortune 500 sites, are very compliant and have dedicated budgets for disability and compliance, and are utilizing vendors to implement that for them.
I have a question here for our guest. How do you plan an accessibility project? And also, the client says how far they want to go with the accessibility. I mean, there's different levels for accessibility.
Right.
The client says how far they want to, or do you suggest a level?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's an interesting talking point. Maybe there is some of a sell to the client on that point of view. Really more about education. Essentially, there are 3 levels to accessibility compliance: level A, AA, and AAA. We consider level A to be a fail. AA is certainly a pass on, the middle of the road or slightly above average. Some elements are pretty tough to integrate or develop on a full AAA compliance level. But it starts up with the question of just like it would be for UI, UX, or branding, who is your audience? Who's your target market? What are your goals? And developing a strategy around that. If a client wants to essentially, I think it can go both ways, for and against. If a client wants to develop a fully AAA compliant site and be the leader in the space, well, we can do that. We have a project right now that we are working on. Their initiative, their mission, is to be the leading provider in their space with a fully compliant, shoot for the sky, AAA across the board website. That's the kind of the best of breed client you can wish for. I think they're more of an outlier at this point in our industry, but I think it's definitely on the rise. To answer your question directly, I think it's a conversation. We all have constraints, time, resources, budget, always going to factor into that. Compliance does cost more, but at the end of the day, it delivers more as well. So I think it starts off with a conversation. I think you have to have a clearly defined strategy. I think you have to know where you're going and who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to remain adaptable and flexible to adjust, over time as needs change, as with any project. I don't think the needs are different. I think they're just more specific.
Right.
Make that distinction.
Daryn, maybe we can help the audience to understand who should be compliant. I mean, if I am a service provider for the government, I know I have to be compliant. But if I'm a small website trying to get into the market, or maybe I'm a new application and starting to get user base just now, should I be compliant already, or when is the right time to be, and who should be compliant?
Yeah, interesting conversation. No, if you are essentially just a startup website, a startup application, not doing business with the government, and not interested in any capacity of attracting or being accessible to the disability space, there's no initiative that says that you need to be. If you want to differentiate and reach, you know, the part of the market that is, that you want to tap into, that is accessible or disabled, then that's a choice, but there's no mandate around forcing you to do that.
Right, but just to remind the audience, you said there's 2 billion people that have some form of disability. Is that right?
The stats are currently over 1 billion.
Okay, I mean that's a pretty significant population.
Right.
And it's growing. It's definitely growing as well. That's from 2014.
Right.
Which means that there's a lot of people that are basically left behind. Go ahead, Misal. They're left behind. I mean, how do we bring more awareness to this?
Well, I'm going to ask you a question directly. I think Michelle might have had a comment. Do you want to jump in here?
No, exactly. I'm trying to drive this conversation with stakeholders, and in terms of we are losing this big chunk of market, we are leaving behind all these people that could bring business to our product and to our website. So I think, or oriented into that space, we can bring more awareness into teams and into clients as well.
Yeah. You know, this is a great conversation at this point in our interview, because we can split off into two kind of ideas here. One being the vendor provider aspect, you and I, and one being, you know, the kind of industry. Both of us in our own unique ways pushing the envelope and moving us forward. If you are playing in that space, you are certainly doing your part to bring awareness and to essentially move us forward. And the industry, in terms of the technology I spoke about before, you know, the translation and the facial recognition and image recognition, these automated AI tools, industry players are helping to move technology forward, inadvertently moving the disability space forward, because they're helping everybody across the web have, you know, a much more robust user experience. We just happen to be able to leverage the power of the AI behind these technologies to help our initiative. Which might be a good segue for me to start talking about ZenythGroup's AI push and our vision around how we see our part in that.
Yeah, we'd love to learn more about that. It was interesting. I had an interesting chat yesterday with someone who's been in the AI space for 20 years, and it opened my eyes how, from a user experience, like the future, how it's going to change with these virtual assistants and these other technology that have nothing to do with browsing at all. So I'm curious, where are you going with that? You know, how is that going to lead things forward, and could it create a more inclusive environment?
It certainly can, Tulio, and I'm glad to hear you having those kind of conversations. Dialogue on that level, regardless of whether you're a vendor or not, just brings awareness and moves the conversation forward, which, you know, globally raises our awareness. So keep those conversations going for sure. Well, for us, it's different. I mean, we certainly are very much focused on the browser space. Our technology is dependent on users being online. So there's certainly a lot of offline AI tech, which is assistive. You know, devices that are just going to be used in our homes and in our workplaces, and we call it the interconnectedness. I can't speak right now, sorry, the interconnectedness of it all, where you leave one location and that content and that data travels with you, follows you, connects seamlessly to your next location. There is still a device that's required to either, you know, speak to you and tell you the content of the data, or a device that's required to display that data visually. But what lies behind all of that is artificial intelligence and the ability to tie this all together. So, I mean, that's actually a different conversation and a much bigger conversation, and probably out of the scope of what we're talking about today. But to just take a step backwards and drive us to what we're dealing with over here, our question is based on a very simple question of of what if. Sorry, Ms. L, did you have a question?
Yeah, just want to add more color to what we're talking about, to what we were talking about, awareness in the market that we're losing. I believe when these all technologies, AI and virtual reality, start to make the market more inclusive, I think what will happen is that we are going to be in a position in which we need to do that as well, because our competitors are already doing it. So when Twitter, Uber, and all other applications start to describe the images, me as a user will want that as well, to be in my current experience with another product. So that's called liquid expectations, in which what others are doing, I want to do the same on this particular app. So I think
exactly right.
I'm just trying to say that it will be a matter of, once it goes ubiquitous, we will be talking more about this, not because it's something that we need to be compliant with necessarily, but because we are losing business opportunities.
That's exactly right. The old adage is essentially when the pendulum swings all the way over, when that paradigm shift happens, everything's set back to zero, right? So you get a clear playing field, and it allows a new space, like in the artificial intelligence space right now, to see the rise of new vendors, new players, new technology. And in AI's case, it's meteoric. I mean, if you think of the adoption and the distribution of these new technologies, it's rapid, right? So if you're building these applications as a framework or as a platform, it allows vendors like myself and other players in the industry to tap into these existing systems in a way that allows us to leverage them completely. IBM's doing an amazing job of opening up their Watson platform to developers. The open APIs are incredible, and it brings the power of artificial intelligence to any company that wants to start to play in that space. Yeah.
I once was giving this advice from another designer. He said that we should be designing experiences as if we were all disabled, because in a way, we are all exposed to noise, to bad light, to conditions in the environment that are not the ideal. So our website or application should be compliant with all these rules and guidelines that are already established. So font should be bigger and all that.
Great. Well, essentially, that's another perfect segue to how AI can essentially solve some of this usability, UI, UX, dilemma. So currently, traditionally, if you want to build a compliant website, you are almost building it for the lowest common denominator, right?
Also, there's another advantage that you have by doing your website compliant, which is Google is another user, and Google does not understand many of the labels and the tags that we put in the website. So in the end, you get a higher ranking just by placing the right tags and right conditions into your website. So that's another win.
I mean, yeah, look, I can't refute it either way. There is probably some inherent advantage. It's definitely an inherent advantage to building a site correctly with the right tags. And I don't think SEO is going to be the most specific benefit of the outcome, but it definitely can't hurt. Some of the standards that we're talking about go beyond just a meta, an alt tag or the correct way to SEO out of site. Content has to be it has to be readable, has to be understandable, almost to a 5th grade level. So a traditional website might have a massive paragraph of very flowery content. Some of the automated text summarization tools that are coming out right now are using very advanced algorithms and machine learning to produce shorter text abstracts. So if you leverage that technology on your site, you essentially don't have to design around it anymore. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say design around it. You use that as a tool to help you design around it, because you take these tools on the front end, and as you know, Ms. L, you can't design content around a site, right? It should be the other way around.
True.
So if you use these tools on the front end, it could put out readable, blocks of content that are understandable for all user types, and essentially help and enable your user, or your UI UX design approach. And that's just one of many tools that play into that conversation. Yeah.
Daryn, this is a great conversation today. We're coming up to the end. We have just a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else you want to share with us before I hand this back to Carmen to wrap up?
Yeah. Just quickly to circle back on the simple question we're asking over here. It just started at a TED Talk a few years ago, and it was called What If? And so I thought to myself, well, what if? What if instead of designing a website for the lowest common denominator and having essentially a very low-end user experience, because you have to cater to your entire demographic, we could use AI to leverage and essentially dynamically adjust the user experience on the fly to cater to a specific disability. So what we're prototyping right now is essentially an AI-driven platform which will determine your disability on the front end. We know by the accessibility controls you have enabled on your computer what your disability might do, and we can have an algorithm to sniff that out. And on the fly, 1,000 people can see your site in 1,000 different ways at the same time and all have a specific user experience. And that's the power of AI and how we hope to use better technology to create a more inclusive user experience for users with disabilities across the web.
Okay, that's the words of wisdom for Daryn, for the all access, the website for all the people. I only have the final question is, what is your big win? What you consider the big win in this step to the accessibility websites and apps?
Oh, the big win is awareness. When we can build a website or technology or provide a product or service or get some exposure through shows like this or at events where one more company or vendor or industry expert goes, it's important, I get it, I'm an advocate and I want to jump on board, and we create awareness. I think that's the win right there, because it means we're doing a good job and we're creating recognition across our initiatives. And as you know, awareness is contagious. You become an advocate, you become an ambassador, and the next thing, you have a small country behind you that's pushing initiative forward. That's
actually really, really cool to wrap this up, to encourage all of providers, service programmers, people learning about building technology. I think it's an inspiration to make access to everyone involved, literally, for all the demographic. I think that is a big win.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're wrapping this up. I want to thank you, Daryn. I want to thank all of Tulio, Victor, Carlos, Misael. And any final words? Say goodbye to our audience.
Thanks again, Daryn.
Great, guys. Thank you all very much individually. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Daryn.
Great having you with you today.
And finally, one more thing is that for the audience, if you're watching, just remember that you can find out more about Daryn or the Zenith Group right there on the DojoLIVE website. This interview is being recorded, so it'll be up there. Just go to our interviews section, just find for Daryn and the Zenith Group, and it'll be all in there. So on behalf of myself and my fellow teammates, thank you so much for been with us today on one more great interview on DojoLIVE, connecting experts like you. And before we go, just don't go, one more quick announcement about next week. Next week, we're going to have, excuse me, we're going to be talking with KG Charles Harris. He is the CEO from Querio. And we're going to be talking about using AI precisely and getting information out of corporate systems with ease. That's his chosen topic. So He says intelligence begins with a question. So that's there, folks, for about next week's interview. Be on the lookout. Same venue, dojo.nearself.com, 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, 1 p.m. Mountain, and of course, noon Pacific. Without any further ado, closing time. Thank you so much, folks. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.